Welcome, everybody, to the train station on tncradio.live. We appreciate you tuning in today. I am Bill Waldrop, along with my co-host Jim Leaders, and our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg, who has a very extensive history in railroading going way back, and we're going to talk about his life of railroading and the different positions he has done with different railroads. Good afternoon, or good morning, sir. How are you? And welcome to the show.
Doing great, Bill and Jim. It's great to be with you this morning.
Thank you, sir. Well, as we always do with our guests, we'd like to find out more about you. Where were you raised? And, you know, I see on your bio here that you started in railroading in 1964. How in the world did you get involved in railroading? Did you have family members in it or relatives? Or kind of tell us your history.
No relative of mine has ever worked for a railroad. Nobody on my mother's side, father's side. And as a matter of fact, people on my mother's side were aghast that I wanted to follow that career. My dad was a little bit more amenable to it because he grew up in upstate New York, in Champlain, New York, on the Rutland Railroad. And the guys on the local on the Rutland used to carry him back and forth between Rutland and Rouse's Point. And as I was growing up, he was telling me stories about how he visited the crews on the Rutland and they let him ride on the steam engine. So that later on, by the way, I was born while my dad was flying out of Tinian, flying missions over Japan. I was born just before the end of World War II. And when my dad came back, he settled in San Antonio and was at a dairy farm. I grew up on a dairy farm. And the SP went right by the dairy farm. And I was a whole lot more interested in the trains than I was in the cows. And the work on the railroad seemed a whole lot more interesting. I started hanging out in the depot at Lacoste with the agent when I was about 11 or 12 years old and just spent hours listening in on the dispatcher, listening in on the message phone. On the dispatcher, I could find out where all the trains were and how the trains got authorized. And on the message phone, I could hear the roadmasters talking to each other and talking to the engineering department in San Antonio about what all they were going to be doing the next day. And I never got tired of listening in. And the first agent that ever allowed me to do that was Coy Streetman, who ultimately retired at Flatonia in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. But Coy, back in 1957 or 8, let me start being there in the depot with him at Lacoste. He later moved on to Weimar, and there was a succession of other agents at Lacoste, some happier to have me hang out and listen on the dispatcher's phone than others. But by then, the local crew got to know me, and I got to know all of them. And the local crew on 85 and 86 would carry me on little trips. One would carry me over to Hondo, and the other crew coming back the other way would carry me back. I was at Lacoste during the days that the Argonaut was still running. And so with that train having come off in 57, that tells you a little bit about that. It was in 57 that Peter Josserin wrote Rights of Trains. And about 2 or 3 years later, I got hold of that book and started studying it and understood by the time I got through really studying it, the difference between the Uniform Code, the General Code, and the Southern Pacific Book of Rules. I was more interested in how the railroad was run than what kinds of locomotives were on the trains, or a lot of the things that people who are interested in the railroads now know a lot about. A lot of the arcane things that I think are arcane were things I wasn't all that interested in because I was fascinated by how you made decisions that made the railroad run. And when I got to be about 16, I had my driver's license, and could go into San Antonio. I could hang out in the tower at East Yard, in the wire chief's office, in the depot at San Antonio, in Tower 105 out by the stockyards. And that opened up a new world for me because I started figuring out how all of that stitched together. The hours I spent in the wire chief's office in San Antonio, the in office, the call letter was in for the wire chief's office. I could listen to every circuit that came through that wire chief's. I never could understand all of the ways they made their patches, right, and how they got the communication lines up and running again around interruptions in the wire. But I watched them do it, and I learned where I could plug in and listen to any dispatcher's line I wanted to that went through San Antonio. So it was in about 62 that we moved down to Corpus Christi. We had to sell the farm, unfortunately. Farm wasn't making it. Small dairy farms weren't making it. I went down to Corpus Christi, but still hung out around the railroad and spent a lot of time around the Tex-Mex SP joint yard. This was just after the Bascule Bridge had been retired at the mouth of the Corpus Christi ship channel, and the Tule Lake lift bridge had been installed. And SP trains, instead of going to the downtown SP yard in Corpus Christi, started going out to the joint yard. Well, I made myself a pest around everybody that was a railroad employee in Corpus Christi, including at the traffic office, which is what they call the sales office back in those days. A guy named Tommy Reynolds said, you know what? You need to go to work for the railroad as soon as you turn 18. And he lined up the division agent to talk to me, and the division agent talked to me, and I interviewed with him, and lo and behold, I got a job clerking on the SP, went down to Brownsville to make my first day on the railroad in June of 1964, my first day working on the railroad. And that summer, of course, these are the days before there were guaranteed extra boards. So there were a couple of weeks that I just didn't have work, but I went anywhere that there was work. And I worked in Brownsville, Edinburgh, Corpus Christi, Gregory, Port Lavaca, from Rosenberg. And then I went to college my freshman and sophomore years up at Austin College in Sherman, and the same clerk's district covered that up there. And I actually worked in Tower 16 and up at Denison as an operator before that just got to be too much for my school work. I was spending way too much time having fun working in the tower at Sherman or at the agency at Denison. And
a slight distraction.
Yeah. And so push came to shove and I had to give that up. But the following year, I went to work as a trainman at San Antonio, working west out of San Antonio, either to Del Rio on through freight or down to Eagle Pass, or on passenger, we went all the way out to Sanderson. By then, there was no more Argonauts, so it was just number one and number two. You'd go out on number one, which was an all-night job, come back on number two, which was another all-night job. So nobody liked those jobs. And so they always got shoved down on the very youngest brakemen or people who worked the job regularly who were no longer physically able to work as a brakeman or conductor in through freight. So I guess that's a Cliff's Notes version of how I went to work on the railroad. There were a lot of interesting things in between. In losing the dairy farm, it kind of opened up railroading as a career for me because, as I said earlier, my parents weren't really wild about my going to work for the railroad, but going to work for the railroad and having an income from Southern Pacific was the only thing that could pay for college. So since I was paying for my own school, there really, after I was 18, nobody had any type of influence on what I was going to do, which was a good thing because the whole time I was in high school, friends of mine were talking about what they were going to do, what they were going to go into their dad's business, or they were going to be a lawyer, or be a doctor, and they were going to study this or that at universities. And I never, ever wanted to do anything but go to work in railroad operations, and actually stayed up nights worrying about what happens if I don't get to work on the railroad. What am I going to do? Because there anything else I wanted to do except go into railroad operations.
Well, and it was a very long and impressive career. And we're going to go over that more, the different levels that you attained all the way up to the top in management. And it is a fascinating story. Our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg. We appreciate him joining us here on the train station. This is TNCRadio.live. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Great leaders challenge their people not to stop at the first right answer. Tighten the Lug Nuts is the book that will help you move past that first right answer to be more effective, more productive, and more successful. This book serves as a blueprint that can be easily applied by leaders, entrepreneurs, truckers, owner-operators, all of us in our everyday lives. This is one of the best leadership books you can read to help you accelerate towards your personal and professional goals. Plus, a portion of the proceeds will be donated to truckerschristmasgroup.org. Visit TightenTheLugNuts.com to order your copy today. Hey drivers, did you hear music on TNCRadio.live that you really liked? Or maybe you heard us interview an author of a book you'd like to read or listen to. You can get the books, music, and other products you hear about by going to our website at www.tncradio.live and clicking on the shopping cart.
Welcome back to the train station on TNCRadio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop, along with co-host Jim Leaders. By the way, if you have any questions or comments about the show, you're welcome to contact us via email. Our email address is houstonrailfans@gmail.com. Our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg, with a fascinating and long history of his history of working in in the railroad industry for many, many years. And Rollin, we last picked up on the last segment. You held positions of trainman, and then from there, you moved up to like assistant train master, manager of intermodal hub operations, terminal superintendent, and moved up the ladder. So, kind of, if you don't mind, just kind of talk about how you moved up and how those positions became available to you.
I transferred from Austin College to Northwestern University because Northwestern had all of the courses I wanted in transportation and railroading specifically. No other university in the country did. Tennessee came close, but Northwestern had everything I needed. However, I held on to my seniority because if I didn't do that, I wasn't going to have the money to get through school. So while I was going to Northwestern, I would do things like mark up from O'Hare Airport for a passenger run and get down to San Antonio and go out on the passenger run and then get back on an airplane and go back to Chicago just to maintain my seniority. The superintendent and the local chairman both knew what I was doing, but they were kind of cheering me on to get through school. And I promised that I would stay with the railroad if they'd work with me on that. And it worked out. So I graduated from Northwestern in '67 and went into the SB management training program in San Francisco, which was really the most boring part of my entire career. Just spending weeks following people around in departments that were very critical, but just not all that interesting. I did not like going to work at the foot of Market Street. I did not like living so close to Haight-Ashbury, having come from Texas like I did. And I was really glad to get out of the training program and go down to San Antonio for my first supervisor's job, which was night assistant train master at all places, East Yard. Now, I knew all these folks around East Yard. I knew the clerks, I knew the yard masters, I knew lots of the locomotive engineers, because by that time I'd been a trainman for 3 years, working with all of these guys. And the yard masters, even before that, when I would spend time just hanging with them in the yard master's tower. That is one job that, even though it worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, except for 2 days off every 2 weeks, I couldn't get enough of it. I loved being a supervisor at East Yard. But then along came an opportunity for this new thing that was called intermodal. It was evolving from strictly piggyback and backing down ramps with trailers to what ultimately became the intermodal systems that you see all the railroads have today. But my first job was in Dallas, and I spent a year in '69 in Dallas at what we now would now call an intermodal hub, but it was actually 5 ramp tracks that you could stick as many as 12 or 13 90-foot TTX flat cars down, and had these truck drivers with the skills to back all the way down 26 stanchion spots to spot cars on the very end of the cut, and just keep doing that, banging those trailers back and forth. So when I went to St. Louis, East St. Louis in '70, it was a little bit more sophisticated. We actually had a side loader, piggy packer, and those were used to make up the flagship train, the Blue Streak merchandise. And by that time, there were 2 different kinds of merchandise on the train. There was the merchandise that came out of the Acme warehouse, which Cotton Belt and Southern Pacific had gone to supporting Acme with these installations instead of having to run their own LCL and LTL networks. And so you'd have box cars of Acme merchandise, and you'd have intermodal trailers, including U.S. mail, on the flat cars coming out of East St. Louis. And of course, the highlight of the night was running the BSM. Well, one thing that happened while I was there was that the 2 train masters both got sick at the same time. And the terminal superintendent there asked me if I would go up in the tower and work as a train master and try to cover my duties running the hub, while I was also working the night train master's job in the tower while the BSM was being loaded and gotten out of town, which of course I jumped at. The terminal superintendent had been there about 9 or 10 months at that time, and that was Rob Krebs. And so that gave me my chance to show everybody that I was really more interested in running trains than I was running an intermodal hub. And my chance came when Rob then was promoted to division superintendent at Pine Bluff. And I got to follow him right up to terminal superintendent there at East St. Louis. And I worked there for a while until he had me and the terminal superintendent at Pine Bluff switch positions. And I went down to Pine Bluff and ran the hump yard down at Pine Bluff. And believe me, it was a whole lot more fun initiating the BSM out of East St. Louis than it was taking about 4 or 5 trains that had to be humped ahead of the BSM's arrival at Pine Bluff, spreading all that stuff out, bringing the BSM in and then turning it into 3 outbound trains leaving Pine Bluff. Because by the time you did that and used almost half the tracks in the bowl to get that done, the yard was just destroyed every morning when that last BSM left, and you had to re-hump several tracks just in order to get the yard straightened up and try to do some northbound hunting before the thing started all over again. And the big challenge was not to get too far behind every day so that you just got the yard irreparably behind, and then the railroad would just snarl up because of it. So that was one of the more stressful jobs I ever had. But at the same time, it was a job that just taught me a lot. Well, and after that, just because I speak Spanish and because SP and a consulting firm had made a partnership to take a World Bank contract and help the Nacionales de Mexico Railroad, I went down and spent 10 months in Mexico City consulting the Nacionales de Mexico. But because of my Pine Bluff experience, I was able to consult them in the operation of Valle de Mexico Yard and the operation of unit trains and the locomotive management system. I actually took those folks up to St. Paul and showed them how the BN was keeping track of their locomotives. So that was fun, but the opportunity came up to go to Ennis in 74, early 74, and I did that. And Ennis had to be one of the most fun and rewarding things I'd ever done, because when I was in Sherman and Denison, I really got to know the top end of the railroad. Being an operator up there, I knew how dispatchers fixed the trains at Hearn, and patted them on the butt with the last bit of running orders at Bremond, how Corsicana worked, and how Miller Yard worked, how Ennis worked. But when I went up there, the place was in not such great shape. Everything was behind. Trains were taking full 12 hours to make it down to Hearn sometimes, or even worse, making it from Hearn back up to Ennis. And so after suffering through that for about 6 weeks, we came up with a different operating plan where we took some cars out of Ennis Yard, and we did that by Fort Worth and Sherman and Miller and Denison, all just making Houston blocks, so that 2 trains, one off the Fort Worth branch and one off the top end, starting all the way back in Denison, came through with cars that just went down the main line and went right straight to Houston. And Ennis Yard itself started handling very few Houston cars. And that gave Ennis Yard enough breathing room to where it just became a black hole. It would just accept any train that was pointed at it anytime. And you didn't have these trains hanging out at Angus and Good and Grosbeck, waiting out there for hours while it just met sections of the Blue Streak merchandise, and then finally just barely making it on into Ennis. In fact, our goal was that crews could go down to Hearn and either double right back or get their 4 hours off, but never have to have their full 8 hours off and just aggregate coming back, because the dispatcher could always count on the fact that Ennis Yard would accept the trains, which gave the dispatcher all the time that dispatcher needed in order to get the trains to Ennis.
Hey guys, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back to that in just a minute with more stories. Our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg. We appreciate him being here, and you are in the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Walter and Jim Leaders as my co-host, and we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Kathy DeCaro is nothing short of amazing. She not only drives the world's biggest truck as a heavy equipment operator in northern Alberta, Canada. She's an international motivational speaker and the author of Dream Big, an autobiography about overcoming a lifetime of trauma and abuse that led to dreams of success. Kathy inspires people the world over to change their lives and improve their self-worth. Her book will change your life. She's passionate about personal growth and believes anyone can change their circumstances and overcome their obstacles if they believe in themselves. Her life will amaze you and seriously inspire you. Be sure to order a copy of her book, Dream Big, on Amazon.com.
Be sure to catch the Truckers Network radio show with your host, Shelley Johnson, weekdays at 3 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on tncradio.live. Welcome back to the train station on tncradio.live. I'm Bill Waldrop along with Jim Leaders, and we can be contacted at the email address of HoustonRailFans@gmail.com. Drop us a note. Let us know what you think about the show and if you have any questions or comments. Our guest today is Rollin Bredenberg with a very lengthy railroad history and career. Fascinating stories here. Jim, I know you have some questions for Rollin, so take it away.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Rollin, let's talk about the National Railway Historical Society convention in St. Louis in June of 1990, where 4 different railroad steam engines came to town. And of course, the 819 of the Cotton Belt was one of the stars of the show. So tell us your experiences about the big trip that we did on a Sunday. And I believe that was the return from St. Louis to Pine Bluff. Some of our members from the Houston chapter, the Gulf Coast chapter, rode down on the train to Elmo, I believe, and we took the bus back. But tell us about that trip.
Well, that was a trip that we knew by then. At that point in time, by the way, I was general manager in Houston, and the Pine Bluff division was one of the divisions on the Eastern region. I really, if I'd been able to, would have liked to have ridden the trip both ways. But I couldn't. Best I could do was fly up there on Friday afternoon for the dinner Friday night, attended what events I could on Saturday, and then the next day was able to ride the train back down to Pine Bluff. Now, of course, between St. Louis Union Station and the MacArthur Bridge, that's all TRRA. TRA was focused on that train, and actually so was the Union Pacific getting the train across the MacArthur Bridge. And then Gratiot Tower got us across the MacArthur Bridge in good shape, and then all the way from Valley Junction, where you come off the MacArthur Bridge down to Elmo, where you got off, is all Union Pacific. It had been Missouri Pacific before UP took over MP, and they did a great job of getting the steam engine down the railroad. It was probably because they wanted it off the railroad. But,
Yes.
but as you know, the 819 had made several trips, and everybody knew that it was a reliable steam locomotive. And once again, it had a very good trip, but it did take a while to get it to Pine Bluff. That is a long reach for a steam engine with the servicing stops and so forth. So after servicing at Elmo, starting out on the Cotton Belt, now you're into single track territory instead of the double track territory, which the Chester sub basically was between Valley Junction and the Thieves Bridge at Elmo. So now you're in single track territory, and there were, of course, lots of trains. And it was just about impossible to run that train without being delayed if you didn't fry the railroad. And nobody on the train, since Bob McClanahan, as you know, was former division superintendent on the Pine Bluff division, and I was a current general manager, nobody, either with the 819 or with the railroad, was willing to let the 819 completely disrupt the railroad. So we were late getting into Brinkley, where we had another service stop. And coming into Brinkley, it was already dark. Wasn't supposed to have been, but it was. And I wanted to say something to the folks on the steam locomotive, so I just decided I'd walk up across the tender to go do that. Well, what I didn't know was that getting ready for the watering at Brinkley, somebody had opened up the hatch covers on the tender, and I walked right into one of those and had to put out my arms to keep myself from falling all the way into the tender.
Oh my goodness.
And it really wrenched both of my shoulders. And yet I was general manager and was not willing to admit to anybody I'd pulled such a stupid stunt. and so just grinned and bore it.
How did you go out of there? Did you pull yourself out, or did somebody see you and came up and help you?
Nobody saw me.
Oh my goodness.
Thank goodness nobody saw me. And I just, I pulled myself up out of there because I'd flexed my elbows to where I didn't go all the way down in there.
Right.
But then I had to pull myself back out of the hole. So that was something that I don't think of except when somebody really mentions that 819 trip. But when you mention the 819 trip, my body remembers that one for a long time.
I bet.
I'll bet. Another topic, David Bernstein, who has written many articles and many books about the SP in our eastern region here. Now, did he work with you when you were general manager here in Houston, or was he just a friend?
No, he was a dispatcher.
A dispatcher, okay. And what territory did he work?
He worked them all.
All of them.
Yeah, he was qualified on every district there was. You kind of had to be as a young dispatcher, and
Right.
he was a young dispatcher, but he was one of these guys that, even though he didn't have a whole lot of seniority, was very, very interested in how the railroad ran. His depth of knowledge about what happened and why it happened went far beyond some of the old heads who it was just a job for.
Right. Did he ever become a chief dispatcher?
Oh yeah, he became a chief dispatcher. As a matter of fact, he for a spell went out to California and was in the transportation department, operations planning and control in the San Francisco office out there.
I see. Okay, let's talk now about a little bit about the famous meltdowns here in Houston in 1979 and 1996.
So in 78 and 79, the SP just got in poorer and poorer shape around the Houston area. Poor shape in terms of condition of the railroad, poor shape in terms of having enough power to keep everything moving, and really was suffering from a cultural lock in terms of how things were done and how you used Englewood Yard and how you used the other yards. So that Englewood Yard was the epicenter of what was the SP's meltdown down there, because trains could not get into Englewood Yard. And of course, if you don't get the trains into the yards, you don't get the power in. And so now you have trouble getting trains out. And one of the first things was done in 78 and 79 was new receiving and departure tracks were built on the south side of Englewood. I believe that there were, in addition to the thoroughfares, there were probably 4 or 5 new receiving and departure tracks built, which just filled up. And now you just had more cars holding at Englewood. It didn't help a whole lot. When all of that was going on, I was superintendent of the Western Division at Oakland and would read about all of these trains holding, all of these hours of service tie-ups. And I would keep sending supervisors down to the Houston Division just to pitch in. And what that meant was they kind of were a train masters and road foreman's extra board who got on and ran trains when the railroad ran completely out of trainmen and enginemen to run the trains, which was often.
Right.
That objective, distant, high-level look at what was going on down there and being happy that I wasn't part of it all ended one day in December, a couple of weeks before Christmas, when Bill Lacey called me and said, Bredenberg, starting January 1st, you're the superintendent of the Houston division. And I thought, no. No.
Really?
Anything but that.
Right. I was really enjoying the Western Division. I'd been on the Sacramento Division a couple of years. I'd enjoyed being at Roseville, being up on Donner Pass when it snowed and all of that. And that was just a long, long way from all of the mosquito-infested horrors that were going on down in the Houston area. But I went down there, and it was, on one hand, on my way in from the airport to the general office that first day, and it was on the holiday. It was on January 1st that I showed up. I was thinking, boy, this is going to be exciting. More than one person had told me, not Bill Lacey, not Rob Krebs, who by then was vice president of operations, but peers and colleagues. Well, Rollin, just look at it this way. You're either going to get fired or you're going to get promoted. And and I knew that was going to happen one way or the other. It was horrible. It was working 16 hours a day. It was working 7 days a week. And it was just trying to sort out what was happening. And the way we ultimately came out of it. And really, looking back on it now, it seems so simple. How do you get yourself out of that? Well, Inglewood Yard is the key. And at Inglewood, if you're doing things at Inglewood that Inglewood should not be doing, or you could figure out a different way to do it so that they didn't have to occur at Inglewood or occur at all, then Inglewood had time to hump all of the cars that had to make the train-to-train connections and industry-to-train and train-to-industry connections in the Houston area. But here's what was going on. Back in those days, there weren't all of the unit rock trains you see today. These days, all you have is unit rock trains. Back in those days, we were just coming out of the period of time when, yes, the Staggers Act was in effect, but the Railroad Commission of Texas thought it really controlled the railroads. And so there were tariff rates on rock that kept railroads from being able to just shut down financially or economically single car rock movements that came out of origins like Beckman outside of San Antonio, or Texas crushed stone around Georgetown, or any of the other places, and just get spread out amongst all of these team tracks all around town. So they'd come into Houston in these trains, and these carloads of rock all got humped into the bowl at Houston. And then when the empties got gathered up by the industry jobs, they'd all come back and they'd all get humped again. And the same with grain. Grain was even worse because SP, if you think about it, in its original franchise did not originate any grain. So all of the grain that was going down to the Good Pasture elevator on the Houston Ship Channel on the Clinton branch, every bit of that came off of another railroad. The Good Pasture elevator, because it was not part of the PTRA, because it was part of the original part of the SP, was strictly an SP destination. So what SP got out of that was, even back in those days, it was $150 a car for taking these cars from the HB&T owned companies, which were the Rock Island, the Santa Fe, the Fort Worth and Denver, BN, the Missouri Pacific, and taking all those cars in the midst of transfer cuts from Settegast and Basin Yard and South Yard, and all that got stuck into the East Yard at Inglewood, and all of these cuts that were really mostly grain had to be humped into the bowl at Inglewood, and then would have to wait in the departure tracks on the south side of Inglewood until Goodpasture could take another train in. So as far as the delivering railroads were concerned, it was bottomless pit. You just brought these cars into Houston, you pitchforked them over to the SP, and it was the SP's problem. And the SP got this princely sum of $150 a car to completely chloroform the railroad with grain cars. When there was
Wow.
Well, what was how did you finally get to the bottom line and figure all this out? Is that when the unit trains started?
So we resolved the rock train issue by just running straight by Inglewood to rock unloading destinations. The grain, we had to give the other railroads, the grain origin railroads, some incentive to play ball with us. So what we did was we said, instead of $150 a car, we'll charge you $75 a car if you will give us these cuts of grain in trains of no fewer than 75 cars. And if you will abide by the order in which the grain elevator wants the trains delivered. And we will just simply be the traffic cop. Instead of delivering those trains to Inglewood Yard, you deliver those trains at Gate 8, at Basin 1 and 2, which were the two long tracks we had right at Gate 8, which is at the west end of those support tracks on the Clinton branch. And once that system got started, Inglewood never saw another loaded grain car or empty grain car, loaded rock car or empty rock car. And all of a sudden, the curtain rose and the railroad could run again.
Impressive.
Amtrak, of course, to this day will tell you that the reason why number 1 and number 2 started operating on time between San Antonio and New Orleans is because they took SP to court. Well, obviously, it had not a thing to do with Amtrak taking SP to court. It had to do with fixing the problems that were keeping Inglewood from being able to function and bringing trains in so that there weren't 2 or 3 days worth of trains out on the railroad between Houston and New Orleans, which was the reason why Amtrak couldn't get across the railroad. So that's just something that the folks listening to this podcast can file away and remember every time they hear Amtrak talk about how the only thing that works is taking freight railroads to court.
Well, guys, that's our show for this week. This is the train station on TNCRadio.live. Rollin Bredenberg is so fascinating as a guest, we have asked him to come back next week and tell more fascinating stories about his long career in the railroading industry. So we hope you'll join us. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. We'll see you next week right here on the train station.